This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading from the third part of Comunismo number 10, The Party Facing the Trade Unions in the Age of Imperialism, from the year 1982. Parts 1 and 2 have been released. 10. The most significant struggles of the party. Our incessant work of denouncing union opportunism was always accompanied by constant participation in the workers' struggles, and, wherever the slightest opportunity arose, by an attempt to organize workers' forces on a class level in open opposition to the central unions. In one of our leaflets of 1959, we wrote, "International Communists militate in the trade union merely as members, not because they attach any value to its present action, but because they have the duty to make the voice of the class party and the revolutionary tradition heard by the organized masses, and because they are certain that, in the phase of proletarian recovery, the superstructures imposed by opportunism on the economic organizations will blow up, and the workers will trample the protective trappings of class collaboration under their feet." In November 1961 came out the Tranviere Rosso, a bulletin of the ICP tram driver adherents of the CGIL, in whose first issue read, "We international communists, who continue the glorious party of Livorno, of the militant traditions of the Union, of the proletarian organizations throughout the class, have not ceased for a moment to challenge the current Union leaders, who come from opportunist parties, their ruinous work of destruction of the class union." In May 1962, as the party's trade union activity expanded in conjunction with large workers' strikes, Spartaco, central bulletin of programmatic and struggle organ of the international communists adhering to the CGIL, was published. "We are fighting so that the traditional workers' union, the CGIL, may be reborn as a class union, a union that affirms and defends exclusively and with no quarter the life and work interests of the proletariat, and never accepts to subordinate them to the so-called higher needs of the company, the national economy, the fatherland, much less to the defense of bourgeois institutions." Issue number 1. We never missed the slightest opportunity to organize groups of workers who felt the need to move towards classist positions. The Bonzes system proceeded to dismantle any reference to the red tradition in the CGIL, and we were always the most strenuous defenders of this tradition. In February 1962, our comrades even founded a chamber of labor in Novo del Friuli, managing to hold the leadership for a few months. In 1961, the system of delegating the collection of union membership fees to state and employer offices began to be introduced. We immediately began a campaign against this method and refused to accept it, defending direct membership. In this, we were at the side of numerous workers who instinctively rebelled against this directive that tended to place the union organization in the hands of the bosses and the state. This system of collection deserves criticism in itself, both for its effect on the workers and for the recognition that, in this way, the ruling class openly gives not only that it no longer has any fear of the unions, but that it considers them as organs of permanent conciliation within which the working class must be disciplined in order to be able to control it better. The management will therefore ask the workers which union they prefer to join, in order to make the monthly deductions. It is useless to observe what weapon of blackmail has thus been offered to them. What is far more serious is the control that the capitalists will be able to exercise over a large part of the organization, and which will not fail sooner or later to bear fruit. Il Programma Comunista, June 1961. Another step towards the dismantling of everything in the CGIL that could be used for a serious worker struggle was the establishment of company union sections. This initiative aimed to prevent any possible generalization of the struggles and tended to lock the workers in their individual companies by avoiding connections. It was accompanied by a campaign to show that each group of workers had its counterpart in their company, large or small, and that therefore the company was the natural home of the union, having to proceed to many individual negotiations or disputes with the various directions. Thus, while the employers' front was united over the company limits, they wanted to break the proletarian front. We argued instead that the natural home of the union was outside the company prison, that is, outside the controls or blackmail of the boss. According to this new trade union strategy, which has the presumption of appearing as a new trade union policy in the face of a social system, the capitalist system, The proletariat should move not as a class and proceed not as an army whose departments are employed according to strategic needs in view of the final assault on the enemy camp, but as autonomous company departments, each of which, on its own account and independently of the other, carries out skirmishes within the company. The class union must have its organs of command outside the factory, outside the economic cell of capitalism. Spartaco, December 1963. In 1965, the campaign for the reunification of the CGIL, CISL, UIL began. This unification, which initially met with resistance from the most militant workers, would definitively erase the last formal and symbolic class characteristics of the CGIL, and would mark its definitive transition into a regime union. We then said in issue 25 of Spartaco, the supposed union unity pursued by the CGIL leaders, with the white and yellow unions CISL and UIL, the open expression of the boss's interests, not being carried out, nor being able to be carried out, on the basis of a program of general interests common to all proletarians, aims rather at the objective of the creation of a single counter-revolutionary union organization that imprisons all wage earners. In the same way that yesterday, the only union organization, the CGIL, was broken by the constitution of the CISL and UIL, with the aim of breaking down as quickly as possible the natural resistance of the workers by dividing the proletarian front. The return to proletarian unity either means, as it does now, the complete abandonment by the CGIL of any semblance of class, or, as we hope, it will be the product of the growing class mobilization of the wage earners, determined to find a single compact and invincible organization, the premise of which is the replacement of the traitorous leaders with leaders faithful to the workers' interests. In this way, the unitary union may be made, an ugly copy of the fascist corporate union, but at the same time the CGIL is dead. The communists will not cry bitter tears over this, but if the infamous design of opportunism were to come true, another solid bulwark would be erected in defense of capitalism, and it would be more difficult to return to the workers' struggle. Spartaco, number 19, 1966. Starting July 1968, we printed Sindicato Rosso, the monthly organ of the Central Trade Union Bureau of the International Communist Party. It carried the same masthead as the trade union organ of the party in 1921. The Red Syndicate carried this manchette: "For the class union, for proletarian unity against corporatist unification with CISL and UIL, for the unification and generalization of workers' demands and struggles, against reformism and splitting up the struggle, for the emancipation of the workers from capitalism. Let the organs of the party, the factory, and the union communist groups arise, for the revolutionary leadership of the working masses." The Sindicato Rosso was the organ of agitation and propaganda of our workers' groups, and constituted inside and outside the union the only voice raised against the betrayal of workers' interests. In 1969, the Bonzes brought the delegation campaign to a conclusion by having a clause inserted in the contracts committing company management to the collection of union dues. This act, which was naturally presented as a victory, definitively sanctioned delegation as the only form of union membership. At that time, we organized in all the workplaces where we were present an energetic campaign demanding the return to direct registration through the collectors, refusing and inviting the workers to refuse the proxy. We also succeeded, in some cases, in organizing anti-delegation groups. In general, the new method passed, meeting only our resistance and the spontaneous resistance of a few workers' groups. The Bonzes presented it as a technical problem. In reality, it was a very serious step towards the insertion of the union body into the state and employers' machinery. It was a political act in the direction of fascist unionism. The proxy also served to expel the most conscious revolutionaries and workers from the CGIL, because the Bonzes often refused to renew the membership of those who did not agree to sign the proxy. Faced with the expulsion of our comrades, we did not give up the fight, but we always reaffirmed, with deeds more than words, that with or without the card we would continue our battle against the traitors inside or outside the Union, in the assemblies, wherever the opportunity arose. Refusing delegations does not mean leaving the Union. On the contrary, it means opposing the definitive degeneration of the CGIL. No to delegations, yes to the class union. Sindicato Rosso, number 18, 1969. Our comrades are in the CGIL, and they will remain there. They will participate in the assemblies, the very few that the Bonzes feel the courage to organize. They will intervene in the struggles and common demonstrations. They will never be silent about their program, and not only will they not invite the workers to desert the organization, but they will urge them to remain there to continue the hard battle destined to lead the Union back to the functions of which a bunch of sellouts deprive it. Il Programma Comunista, February 1969. It is at the same time the period of the long contractual struggles that marked the peak of the Italian Union movement after World War II. In this period, in several large factories, at Pirelli, Fiat, etc., the first unitary base committees were created, spontaneous workers' organizations that attempted to bypass the unions, and on some occasions to replace them, making up for the organizational deficiencies of the union bureaucracies, and promoting actions and claims in opposition to the official union line. But the trade unions' centrals then had good game in riding the tiger, and were able to guide and control the movement and direct it according to their objectives, still taking advantage of the period of economic boom that allowed the bourgeoisie to grant, of course not without hard struggles, the crumbs of the rich profits still growing. The union bureaucracies were thus able to seize, with a certain ease, these basic organizational drives and to institutionalize the committees, transforming them into factory councils, not without the explicit help of the employers willing to recognize as workers' representatives only those delegates accepted and recognized by the unions, and importing them from outside in those companies where they had not arisen spontaneously. The factory councils thus became the organizational base of the confederations in all factories and workplaces. It was in those years, and especially in the years that immediately followed, that a process of progressive closeness of the unions to the state institutions and to the economic policy of the bourgeoisie and its parties slowly took shape. Or rather, it was in those years that this tendency, implicit in the unions of the imperialist era and already unequivocally manifested in the new-type unionism of the immediately post-fascist period, underwent a significant acceleration. It was not, therefore, a turning point, a betrayal of the past, as it was presented by some small circles that sprouted like mushrooms in that period, but it constituted an accentuation of the natural propensity of the national democratic unions to become instruments of the ever more efficient functioning of capitalist society. This accelerating stroke did not happen by chance, but coincided with the beginning of the cycle of international crisis of capitalism, which is still deepening, and which, let us remember, had its first phenomenal manifestation in August 1971 with the non-convertibility of the dollar into gold imposed by the USA. This accentuation is in parallel made possible by the joint deleterious effect on the working class of the collaborationist policy of opportunism and of the real increase in the standard of living of large strata of workers reared in the shadow of the impressive development of industrial production in the period immediately preceding it, in turn made possible by the intensive exploitation of the national workforce in the 20-year post-war period, 45 to 65, and by the robberies of all kinds of human and material resources of the countries of the underdeveloped world by world imperialism in general, with the complicity of the national bourgeoisies of these same countries. That is to say, that the process already well identified in our writing of 51, Revolutionary Party and Economic Action, is accentuated. Wherever industrial production flourishes, a whole range of reformist assistance and providential measures exist for the employed worker. These constitute a new type of economic reserve, representing a small stake in wealth, and this makes the position of the worker in those areas in a certain sense analogous to the artisan and small peasant. The wage laborer thus has something to lose, and this makes him hesitant, and even opportunist when union struggles break out, and worse still when there are strikes and rebellions. This was a phenomenon remarked upon by Marx, Engels, and Lenin with regard to the so-called labor aristocracy. In the years following 1951, this phenomenon is accentuated considerably. Ever larger proletarian strata are affected by this acquisition of a small patrimony of guarantees and bonuses, presented as conquests definitively acquired, and which create the illusion to the proletarians that they have finally gained access to an irreversible and constantly growing standard of living and social security. It will be the recent years of the tangible worsening of the economic crisis that will dispel the illusions and once again force the proletariat to face the harsh reality of capitalist society, decrease in the purchasing power of wages, loss of jobs, insecurity about the future, and poverty. It is the accentuation of this phenomenon that made more than a few leftist big mouths of the time pretend that the working class of the industrialized countries was now definitively bourgeoisified and integrated in capitalist society, and that other classes, other social subjects, were called to replace it in the revolutionary function, and that, in parallel, among bourgeois theorists and economists, generated the theory of neo-capitalism, now able to control its internal crises, and therefore to be finally crisis-free and susceptible to be gradually reformed in the sense of a progressive adaptation of its institutions to the economic and social needs of the working masses, and of the people in general. The exceptional world productive impulse of that period was such as to dazzle anyone who was not able to apply the correctly Marxist analysis to the social and economic reality of the present, and therefore all but the party. Notably, all of them, conservatives, reformists, progressives, revolutionaries, drew on the same theories that put the classic proletariat bourgeoisie struggle out of time and history. And today when, as always, the harsh reality of the facts returns to make more transparent that nothing has changed in the traditional class contrast of capitalist society, it is on these theories, with their updates, that basically continue to draw today's leftists when they believe they see the essence of the new social conflicts in the contrast between the stable proletariat and the marginalized one, the latter being a hodgepodge of unemployed, underemployed, urban underclass, angry petty bourgeoisie, common delinquents, in general, all conceived as possible revolutionary subjects as they strive for the immediate satisfaction of individual needs, increasingly denied by the ongoing capitalist crisis. It is in the midst of this exceptional productive expansion of capitalism that, in the second half of the 1960s, and in general after the overcoming of the economic crisis of 64 to 65, an army of young proletarians enters the factories, and there is an almost general change of generation in the Italian working class, which progressively spills over, and in particular during and immediately after 1968 to 69, into the structures of the trade unions. All of this produced an organic turnover of union cadres, especially in the intermediate levels of the factory structures, managed with masterly skill by the unions, which were able to exploit the momentum of 1968 to 1969 and renew many grassroots cadres. The generation of the immediate post-war period, the one that had undergone the influence of the class tradition, that had distinguished itself for its combativeness in the struggles of the 50s, gradually gave way, and in certain local situations even abruptly, to new elements foreign to this tradition and therefore better predisposed to adopt the more and more democratized and reformist ideology advocated by the leaders of the three confederations, who now spoke a common language on all matters. The policy that begins to significantly permeate the entire basic organizational structure of the Union is that of structural reforms, of participation in the economic choices of the government and the companies, of company bargaining, of the organization of work, in which the Union openly makes itself the bearer of the productive needs of the company and shows itself available to the sectorial management of the workforce according to those needs. In this regard, we recall the issue of overcoming piecemeal work with collective piecework, presented by the Bonzes as a step forward on the road to emancipation from exploitation, which in fact responded to specific production needs of many companies, which were able to make the organization of work more flexible to the changing needs of the market. In short, the trade union trinity tries to unite, overcoming the internal contrasts between the various political parishes, adhering more strongly and coherently to its role of social lubricant of the economic and institutional gears of capitalist society. This whole issue is then presented for the need to get out of the factory, to bring the power of the union into society, to develop democracy, to count more in the economic policy choices of governments, and so on. Behind these vague expressions, there is a high degree of collaborationist approach aimed at the total subordination of workers' interests to the needs of the national economy, which today, in the midst of economic crisis, has taken on such blatantly anti-worker aspects. Such a policy, we repeat, is but the natural continuation and democratic style of the corporatist unionism based on the Mussolini model, but which develops in a period that sees the phase of continuous growth of capitalist profits exhausted, thus opening an era of persistent falls in production that, between inevitable ups and downs, marks the constant and progressive restriction of corporate profit rates and therefore also of the state resources available for social services, and that forces the bourgeoisie all over the world to compress the living conditions of workers, and the tricolor trade union to take on its role of propping up the capitalist regime. To physically take on this task are called elements from those ranks that have been able to enjoy the crumbs of the productive boom period of capitalist development after World War II, and therefore embody with a certain conviction and a natural predisposition to objectively embody the role of participation of the Union in the major social and economic problems of the country in a desperate attempt to get out of the crisis, a role to which the Union in those years pushes in the effort to insert itself in all the political and economic ganglia of society. This tendency is present in numerous debates of that period. Worth for all some passages taken from a lecture by Lucio de Carlini, secretary in charge of the Lombardy Regional Committee of the CGIL. If there is a contradiction between the strength and bargaining power of the Union and the overall situation of the country, in order to fill this contradiction, the Union must make choices of general interest, that is, move the class in the general interest of democracy, of the development of our country. And, further on, the economy is going badly, the fault of the capitalist economy, and so far we all agree, of the structures, obviously of the plundering of resources by capitalism and its allies, we all agree. But when we do not understand that this plunder does not concern only the capitalist, the class opponent or the parties, but it concerns us, our condition, then this lack of understanding is a contradiction that we must resolve politically. We cannot advance on unitary ground when there is productive indifference, and this, I want to say it brutally, has never been the characteristic, in all these decades, of the working class. The working class is not indifferent to whether the economy is doing badly or well, or whether the development of the economy of Italian society is balanced or unbalanced. It is not indifferent because it does not have, we do not have, a subordinate conception. We do not have a conception according to which we say that we are interested or not interested in the economy or the social development of our country to the extent that we can carve out, as subordinates, a few liras, a few parts of this economy. We do not have a syndicalist conception of pure redistribution of income, so that others should be in charge of directing the economy, of how to produce income, and I am only concerned with carving out the slice that belongs to me, and also with broadening the redistribution for the workers. On the other hand, we have a concept of transformation, because we cannot advance further on the more typical terrain, the contractual terrain, if we do not transform the economy of Italian society along a line that links claims to reforms, that links the battle of contractual claims to the battle of transformation on the political, economic, and social terrain. If we have recovered in our country on the ground of unity, we must say thanks to the fact that this contradiction, without alarmism, but with deep class awareness, the workers have taken over. They understood that we could not and we cannot move into the future if not bridging the contradiction that exists between strength and bargaining power on the one hand, and the crisis of the country and Italian society on the other. Therefore, let's do away with old-fashioned unionism, based on positions that one would not be ashamed to define as corporatist, that is, simply claiming improvements in wages, regulations, and contracts, and towards the negation of all this, towards the recovery of the Italian economy and society, which should be the main task of the working class. All this approach is progressively taken up, without reservation, by a host of officials who have come to the Union stripped of any serious class instinct, young bonzes and bonzettes, who have now abandoned any reference to the real class struggle and assimilated to the marrow the theories of democratic bargaining, of confrontations with employers and governments on the problems of companies in the country, of efficiency and productivity superimposed on any other interest. The union organization is on its way to becoming a highly bureaucratized apparatus, getting rid of any class residue, that little bit of union life, of the direct relationship between officials and members that still existed, and which had allowed, or could have allowed, a certain amount of internal work by communist militants, was definitively extinguished. The CGIL, as well as the CISL and the UIL, progressively became an organization resistant to any class stimulus, if not to nip it in the bud, and a slow but inexorable separation began, increasingly evident over the years, between the union's territorial structure and its members, who in previous years had generally followed the union's directives with a certain conviction. In the years immediately following the struggles of 1968 to 69, and on the basis of pre-existing elements, the conditions and the general situation matured that would allow the party, in the face of the more tangible signs that would manifest themselves in the following years, to dissolve the historical alternative of the future class movement between the conquest, perhaps violently, of today's unions or the rebirth from scratch. At that time, in the Italian workers' movement, the extremes and the conditions were beginning to arise for the party to bring the problem to the attention of its constant analysis of the situation, indispensable for the correct application of immediate tactics. It was at this time that the party launched the slogan of Committees for the Defense of the Class Union, against the prospect of the unification of the CGIL with the CISL and UIL, which appeared imminent at the time and had already been partially realized through the creation of the category federations. This slogan of ours, which still referred to the defense of the class tradition of the CGIL, was in continuity with the effort made by the party up to that time, in line with the positions it had been adopting in the union field for 20 years, to oppose and call the workers to oppose the process of progressive abandonment of those traditions by the CGIL. The suggestion for the Committees for the Defense of the Class Union, if it was consistent with the struggle which the party had been waging in the union field up to that time, was not, however, accepted by the working class, and the committees did not extend beyond our communist groups. But this indication for Committees for the Defense of the Class Union coincided with the troubled period in which the party selected the forces that now remained the only ones to represent the organizational continuity of the communist left. The painful ordeal of those years, which saw most of the old organization progressively take sides in positions increasingly distant from the classical ones of the left, and therefore from revolutionary Marxism, presented a serious clarification of the union question, which at some point was set aside, in view of the struggle then conducted on issues that went far beyond union tactics. This is not the place to deal with the issues that provoked the organizational split, and that involved the very way the old center conducted the organization. Thus, in the final analysis, the question of the correct assimilation of organic centralism, as the left defined it after World War II, as well as the propensity for maneuvering and the politique de bord, in the persistent illusion of being able to force the course of historical events, which led the old organization, as could be then easily predicted, to all sorts of stragglers, more and more adopting frontist attitudes in the political field and flirt with anyone who claimed to move their ass in the direction of anti-capitalism and anti-opportunism. It was not, as was often misunderstood then and later, the union issue that marked the watershed between the forces that gathered around our monthly organ and those that followed a path increasingly diverging from ours. However, the trade union question could not be immune from the degeneration that took hold in the organization, if only because a political deviation cannot but be reflected on all the main issues into which, for the sake of convenience of analysis, we are used to divide the entire science of revolutionary Marxism. The deviation in this field was expressed through the enunciation of the new gospel in the matter of intermediate bodies between party and class, in the sense that it purported to liquidate the trade union tactics which the party had pursued for 20 years, announcing, in a body of theses which were supposed to straighten out the trade union question, that the future proletarian bodies may well not be the trade unions, and they will not be in a perspective of an abrupt turn in the direction of revolutionary assault, just as it was not they, but the Soviets, in a situation of virtual dualism of power, the link between party and class in the Russian Revolution. So that the indication of the rebirth of the class union, of the proletarian economic organization, was branded as anti-historical, denying at once all the activity carried out by the party after World War II, and more generally, all Marxism. Beyond the historical falsehood according to which, during the Russian Revolution, the Soviets were the only link between party and class, denying the important and irreplaceable function that the trade unions had in this, erasing from its revolutionary program the prospect of the resurgence of immediate organizations with economic content, is tantamount to suddenly tearing up all the theses characteristic of the communist left and of the party in the post-World War II period, and denying even the theses of the International. The fact that these organizations, which will come into being, may not be trade unions in the sense that they will most likely take on an organizational form different from those which exist today, or from the traditional trade unions, as our theses also foresee, cannot mean that they can have an immediate political content such as to be comparable to the Soviets of the Russian Revolution, organizations which cannot come into being if, first, in a brief but necessary phase, the class does not give life to organizations with a purely economic content for its immediate defense, because it's only on this ground that the class can move. It will be from the party's activity in these bodies, and at the same time from its initiatives and interventions among all the classes of society, as Lenin put it, together with the progressive acquisition by ever larger strata of workers of the need to organize themselves in order to wrest political power from the bourgeoisie, that the political bodies of proletarian power can arise. Only in this sense can we say that the split of that sad period also involved the union question. The communists could have accepted any different immediate tactics in the face of the present trade unions, and the parties could certainly not have split over this, but they could not accept the renunciation of the historical perspective of the rebirth of the economic bodies of immediate defense, which only the proletariat, rediscovering its class basis, will be able to determine. They could not accept that the question be posed more or less in these terms. We do not know what characteristics the future class organisms will have, nor do we care to know today, it being sufficient today to work at the level of the class, on an immediate minimal level, abandoning the great general indications in order to throw ourselves headlong into a boorish, pragmatist minimalism from the development of which the party should have derived the indications for action and tactics. It is interesting to note how those who have taken this road have reached the point of indeterminacy in the trade union field, that is, of no longer following a precise tactic other than that of the day-to-day, whereby today one indication is given, tomorrow another, in contradiction with the first, or that of seeing the process of formation of intermediate bodies between the party and the class as an act of will of the party itself, aimed at building bodies, anticipating the real resumption of class struggle, and therefore disconnected from it, thus inevitably mistaking, in this anti-Marxist perspective, the remnants of the 70s leftist groups, or the more or less organized fringes of radical and pro-terrorist movements of sub-proletarian and petty bourgeois matrix, for workers' vanguards with which to flirt in order to build organized points of reference as an alternative to the trade union confederations, without any serious connection with the class. 11. Towards an ex novo rebirth. After the split, having resumed the path of the political struggle organized around the new newspaper, the party continued to re-propose the terms of the doctrine of the union question, and the careful examination of the attitudes assumed by the class in its defensive struggles and the path of its union bodies. Organizational unity into a single regime union has not occurred in an organic sense, nor is it now of much interest to know if and how it will occur. The process of bringing the tricolor bonzes of all shades closer to the institutions and to the needs of capitalist companies and the state that administers their interests has not been stopped. On the contrary, it has continued in recent years with the final consolidation of the method of delegation, the strengthening of the bureaucratic apparatus of professional trade unionists, who now consider themselves officials at the service of the state, complete with a regular salary, the implementation of a police regulation of the strike, the well-established practice of closing any kind of contractual or corporate dispute with the supervision of state ministers, in perfect fascist style, the co-optation of the Union of Police Representatives, the strike meetings in favor of the regime's thugs affected by terrorist attacks, the accusation of terrorism and pro-terrorism towards all militant workers, the acceptance, even formal, the substantial one had always been accepted, of classic capitalist postulates such as the link between the condition of the workers and the earnings of the companies, the necessity of the expulsion of labor power from the factories, and the increase in the utilization of the plants and the productivity of the work of which the union itself became the guarantor, and the open organization of scabs in the face of spontaneous strikes of groups of workers, acting outside of rigid union control. The union structure has become increasingly rigid. Closed off to workers, it is increasingly in the hands of careerist civil servants. This has made impractical the road to its eventual reconquest to a class line that, however, as we have always remembered, could only take place on the wave of powerful proletarian struggles that would break the entire current organizational apparatus. As the crisis progressed, the betrayal of the union leaders gradually came to light. These, who in the years of the economic boom had been able to conduct a smokescreen of defense of working-class conditions, creating as much as possible wage differentiation because this corresponded to the needs of the capitalist economy, and obtaining in this way even tangible results, especially for the labor aristocracy, are now openly refractory to any working class needs. It's more and more obvious to workers the contrast between their own vital needs, the defense of wages and jobs, and the openly renunciatory and collaborationist attitude of the official trade unions of all colors. It is becoming more and more obvious that the defense of these needs can only be expressed outside and against the present trade union structures. In some categories, groups of the most exploited workers have moved in recent years for the first time in open contrast with the directives of the union bonzes, even managing to give rise to significant strikes and to express organizations in open contrast with the organizational structures of the unions. Railway workers 75, hospital workers 78. From the situation that has emerged in recent years, it is now clear not only to us, but also to an ever wider array of workers, that no serious defense of the most basic life needs and work is possible under the protection of the current trade union centers, and that no action of struggle carried out consequently on the class level is possible except outside of their organizational framework. Of course, for workers, the acquisition of this awareness is an instinctive fact and does not automatically mean the possibility of translating it into active action. Beyond minor cases and small companies without much importance, this awareness has been expressed for some years now in a widespread lack of interest in politics and in the work of the official unions, which are increasingly contested in the factory assemblies, where, moreover, there are massive desertions, just as the increasingly rare proclamations of strikes by the unions find less and less adhesion. The dynamics of the transition from widespread apathy towards the unions and their actions to active action in the field of class struggle, independent of the regime unions, will certainly have a non-linear, contradictory development, with steps forward and backward, and it cannot be a priori ruled out that it may also involve locally rank-and-file sectors of the union structure. However, this phenomenon will certainly have a character of radical violence. It cannot be the result of a long internal work of agitation and propaganda of the communists or of the most militant workers, but it will express itself as real episodes of frontal clash between the classes, which will certainly see the whole organizational structure of the current union centers lined up against the workers in struggle. The struggle of the hospital workers was emblematic in this respect. However, the same 35-day-long struggle of Fiat, crushed by the union structure at the moment when it was finally about to assume the classical characteristics of the real class struggle, was certainly no less significant. In the first, the workers in the struggle expressed a class leadership in antithesis to the local union organization, which straight up sided against the strike movement, managing to crush it and recover it in the end, after negotiating and reaching an agreement with the representatives of the state, and after being recognized by the latter as the only official representative of the workers in the struggle, in the spirit of a real regime union, even though its officials were driven out and rejected by the workers whenever they tried to bring back the strike to the bitter end. At Fiat, the struggle, even in its spontaneity and decision, did not express an organizational form opposed to the official bonzes, who were able to ride the tiger easily until the moment when the strike would turn into an open clash against the police, determined to crush the pickets by force by order of the judiciary. The characteristic of a regime union is not that of knowing how to direct a class strike. In this sense, we remember how the same fascist unions, which were also state unions, were forced, despite themselves, to direct class struggles, albeit for short periods, but that of being able to lead them or bring them back into the economic, social, and political compatibility and tolerability of the bourgeois regime. Beyond these two examples of struggle, which, together with those of the railway workers in 1975 and the airline workers in 1979, are the most significant, we should not underestimate the phenomenon that, increasingly often, from struggles or generic attempts to organize themselves to react to the constant worsening of their living conditions, groups of workers tend to organize themselves independently of the union and to act on genuinely classist bases. These more or less organized groups are often short-lived and tormented and fall, lacking a solid link with extended and non-episodic working-class struggles, either under the clutches of the trade union left, which brings them back under the control of the bonzes, or into the grip of sectarian positions agitated by tiny political circles, who tend to transform them into small political conventions, or to act without taking into account the effective link with other workers, and therefore on a voluntarist and adventurist basis. This whole situation, together with the growing detachment between the unions and the working masses, referring also and above all to the grassroots members, many of whom are still members due to inertia and apathy, thanks to the fact that in order to get out of this situation, it is necessary to formally cancel the company delegation to pay the membership fee, a phenomenon that is gradually assuming considerable dimensions, indicates to the party that the alternative between the conquest of the current unions and the creation of new ones has definitively fallen. Thus, the resumption of the class struggle can only express new class organizations, whose development and strengthening will take place not within the structures of the current unions, but outside of them, even if the events of today do not yet allow us to see what specific forms they will take. The present situation, lacking a movement of struggle of the working class masses directed towards the organizational constitution of a network of proletarian bodies alternative to the official unions, does not require and does not allow a formulation of the type. Outside the present unions, let's sabotage their struggles and build another union organization. In this regard, it is important to take up the continuation of the 51 document, which traces the alternative between violent conquest and an ex novo rebirth. Point B reads, considering the party's limited strength, and until it gets far greater, which is not known whether it will be before or after the resurgence of a non-political class organization on a large scale, the party cannot and must not proclaim a boycott of trade unions, company organs, and workers' agitations, nor, where it is predominantly made up of local forces, use in open agitations the slogan of boycott by calling on people not to vote. We are of course referring to votes of a trade union nature. Not to join the union, not to strike, or the like. In a positive sense, in most cases practical abstention and not boycott. The position to be held today can be deduced from this observation. From a general point of view, it is our duty to point out to the proletarians the necessity of the resurgence of class organizations, and also to point out that this will tend to be expressed outside and against the present unions. From an immediate point of view, this means pointing out to the proletariat the necessity of organizing itself independently from the present trade unions, in the perspective of the reconstruction of a class organizational network, even though we are aware that this process can only be the work of the proletariat itself, and that, therefore, as long as the proletariat does not take sides in the class struggle in a generalized and non-episodic way, and the party does not have a marginal influence on it, no indication of sabotage of the current actions can be put forward by us in the immediate future. This, no matter how much they are directed towards increasingly anti-worker objectives, unless we are faced with an explicit will on the part of vast strata of workers to actively rebel against this direction. Nor can an explicit call to leave the tricolor unions be put forward, since today there is no alternative organized reference point capable of catalyzing the workers' will to act. What does it mean to work from now on in the perspective of the ex novo rebirth of a class economic organization? It certainly cannot mean the passive waiting for the spontaneous proletarian movements, resting on a position which envisages, on the one hand, on the level of general propaganda, the indication of the prospect of the resurgence of class unions, and, on the other hand, on the level of practical action, the messianic waiting for the great event, after which the party will pose the problem of influencing the class movement which has risen in the meantime. Going back to the passage quoted above, the expression, which the increase in the party's strength is not known whether it will be before or after the resurgence of non-political class organizations on a large scale, indicates precisely the dialectical and non-mechanistic unfolding of this process, in which the relationship between the development of class movements and their organizational expression and the party's influence in them is not one way, but of mutual interdependence. In practical terms, this means that there can be no contradiction between the strategic indication of perspective given by the party in the trade union field and its immediate practical action. Proletarian militants must therefore work to direct and, when objective conditions permit, organize workers on the class terrain. In other words, as we have pointed out on other occasions, the party has the task of concretely helping, by making available its proletarian forces, the tendency of workers to organize themselves for the defense of their class interests, and providing, in immediate action and organization, the directive capacities that they can derive from the possession of the historical background of the past experiences of proletarian struggle that only the party can possess, and, at the same time, importing in the workers, the consciousness of the fact that purely economic action is ephemeral, and the necessity to embrace the perspective of the revolutionary communist program for the definitive historical solution of their condition as an exploited class. The balance of the two aspects of the question, that is, whether it is preferable to insist more on the purely economic terrain or to carry out interventions of a wider political scope, will be determined by the sensitivity that militants will have in being able to grasp the tendencies and the subjective conditions of the workers with whom they will have to act, their degree of class consciousness, their real propensity to struggle, etc. A sensitivity and capacity that will be better acquired and refined with the progressive qualification in practical intervention. Any intervention and action directed in this direction must have as an indispensable presupposition the predisposition, even of small minorities of workers, to place themselves truly and seriously on the ground of the struggle for the defense of their living and working conditions. Any organizations that may arise from this must be permeated by the tendency to link themselves constantly with the rest of the workers, and to act according to a line of action that realistically takes into account at all times the consistency of this link. In this sense, it is necessary to reject and fight against the tendencies of a group spirit and politicking, often present in these first attempts to organize independently from the unions, which claim to give life to self-described proletarian microorganisms, which are not connected to any context of struggle and to the class, microscopic revolutionary unions that, even if they sometimes proclaim correct class positions, are doomed to being small political sects excluded from the real class movement and continuously torn apart by ideological contrasts between the political groups that compose them, thus appearing in the eyes of the workers, instead of a class reference point of struggle, as yet another small extremist group. The reconstruction of a class-based economic organizational structure cannot be the product of alchemy and test tube experiments prepared by self-styled political vanguards, who are more or less aware of the necessity of the anti-collaborationist economic defense struggle, but the result of a vast proletarian class movement in which the party must spare no energies in order to enable itself to influence and direct it. A movement in which the influence of those who today claim to be its driving forces will certainly be harmful and misleading. Another point to consider is union membership. In relation to, and as a consequence of, the situation described above, we communists are inclined not to join the tricolor unions. This attitude does not derive from considerations of principle, nor from union-splitting tendencies, which have always been excluded and fought against by the communist left, but from the simple practical observation that the tricolor union apparatus, considered in its top-down organizational structure, is now, at the top as well as in its rank-and-file cadres, an organism bureaucratized and impervious to the internal action of a working-class fraction organized autonomously on the ground of class, but adherent to the official union structures, if only because there is no longer an internal union life that allows a minimal work of penetration and influence in the same basic structures of the union. Under these conditions, union membership, even disregarding company delegation, is no longer of any use in order to have a greater possibility of work among the grassroots adherents, a possibility that would remain equal to that towards non-members, and would simply resolve itself to participation in the financing of bodies completely subservient to the capitalist regime. However, precisely because this attitude is not motivated by considerations of principle, in any particular situations, most likely found in the field of small business, where the non-membership of one of our militants in the union would compromise his work in the workers' struggle, the question will be addressed by the party because only the party, and not the individual militant, is entitled to a final decision in such situations. As for the factory structures directly elected by the workers, the factory councils and the like, the question arises in a different perspective. These bodies are almost entirely controlled by the unions. Indeed, in large factories, they are often the real supporting structures of the unions within the factory, whose management is in the hands of the external organization and whose internal life is often sclerotic and apathetic, limiting themselves to endorse the decisions of the executive, the latter in turn an emanation of the union apparatus of the territory. However, they are still composed of delegates elected by the workers and in direct contact with them, and therefore susceptible to be influenced by events that would increase the tension and the will to fight. In addition, in small and medium-sized companies, where in general the grip of union opportunism is less tight, the councils of delegates often enjoy a certain autonomy and are more easily permeable to class positions. For all that, we cannot a priori exclude propaganda and agitation work within them. In principle, without therefore also here excluding decisions to the contrary in particular cases, we are for internal work on the condition of being elected representatives of the workers who see in the elected militant a combative worker willing not to compromise in the struggle against the bosses, and, for this reason, to fight against the colossal obstacle of union opportunism and collaborationism. Obviously, even for this question, we cannot draw up case histories with so many ready-made solutions. The case of militant workers elected as delegates will have to be rigorously evaluated by the party, and every decision will have to take into account the circumstances and the situation in which the election took place. In any case, the attitude of our militant will have to be marked by the constant public dissociation, in front of the workers, from every decision of the factory councils that deviates from the real defense of the class interests, and from every collaborationist, corporatist initiative that moves in the spirit of the good functioning of the factory, and of the recognition of its productive problems, as well as, obviously, to be aimed at the constant denunciation, without subterfuge or half-measures, of the work and of the unfavorable agreements concluded by the factory councils controlled by opportunism. However, it is foreseeable that the adhesion of the factory councils, or fractions of them, to the process that will lead to the reappearance of proletarian classist economic organizations will also have a predominantly episodic and not generalized character, so that the party attaches much more importance to direct work among the workers, and in particular among those strata that are more exploited and more affected by the anti-worker measures of the bourgeois governments and the bosses, and therefore more susceptible to the struggle, thus contributing with its very modest forces to the rebirth of a genuinely proletarian, anti-capitalist class movement, free from the asphyxiating fetters of opportunism, aware that its influence can be decisive to this end. As a matter of fact, in the imperialist phase of capitalism, the existence of free trade unionism is no longer possible, that is, of trade union bodies which, even though they are not directed by a revolutionary orientation, even though they are in the hands of reformist and petty bourgeois parties, can conduct the struggle on the economic terrain in a consequent manner. The economic struggle in the imperialist epoch is transformed much more rapidly than in the past into a political struggle, since its very manifestation and generalization is an attack against the very foundations of the capitalist regime. As a consequence, any trade union organization is immediately confronted with the problem of the state. Either it accepts to limit the proletarian struggle within legality, and thereby restrict and stifle it for the benefit of social conservation, or it transcends the limits of bourgeois legality and enters the revolutionary field, which means at the same time to extend, strengthen, and generalize the struggle that the proletariat conducts in defense of its living conditions. This situation makes all the parties and all the political directions that are for the preservation of the regime to be at the same time enemies of the extended and consequent manifestation of the proletarian economic struggle, and only the Class Revolutionary Party is the most ardent supporter of this struggle. The union function is completed and integrated only when at the head of the union bodies there is the class political party, says the party platform of 1945, and in fact, there is no other way. The deduction to be drawn from this is certainly not that the union is no longer necessary and that the union struggle can no longer exist. It's another lesson entirely, the opposite in fact. The proletarians will return to the struggle for the defense of their economic conditions, and in this struggle, they will reconstruct the organisms suitable for this defense, the class unions. These organisms, by definition open to all workers, by definition organizing the working masses on the basis not of conscience, but of material needs, will find themselves placed by the situation itself in front of the alternative, either to submit again to the control and influence of the state, which is equivalent to the control and influence of the opportunist, bourgeois, and petty bourgeois parties, or, vice versa, to move their action to the terrain of illegality by submitting to the only truly illegal political address, that of the class political party. In our view, therefore, the existence of class unions in the imperialist epoch has an even greater importance than it could have had in past epochs. If in the past it was possible to keep the struggle of the proletariat on the economic field separate from the goal of the ultimate revolutionary conquest, and even to use the economic struggles to constrain them, this is no longer possible in the imperialist epoch. Here, the passage of the class union to the methods and objectives defended by the Communist Party must take place under penalty of the proletarian economic organisms losing their own class connotations, i.e., abdicating the fundamental purpose for which they arose. Within the economic organisms which the class will be forced to express in the return to struggle, the struggle will be fought between all those who want to keep their action within the limits of bourgeois legality, and thereby extinguish and suffocate it, and the direction of the party, which, by pushing for the strengthening and generalization of the proletarian defensive struggle, will thereby drag these organisms onto the revolutionary ground.